So, good morning, everyone. I believe we're ready to go live, or we're already live. Very much welcome to the next Flash Friday on the 10th of July 2020. We're heading into the summer period, and even though in Western Europe the weather is not that great these days, it doesn't really feel like summer yet. Of course, we got a bit of a spirit yet because after the Corona lockdown, things are getting a bit more relaxed, and I think a lot of people are looking forward to have a bit more of a quiet and relaxing summer and actually go out of the house for once. Um, as every Friday, we talk through the news and latest trends in fintech, and of course, we always have an esteemed guest that is helping us to discover our way through that. And today, I'm very honored to have Devie Mohan with me. So very much welcome. Very great for you to join us today. I think you've got great insights into the fintech developments, especially also seen in your latest book that have been written that we wrote about last week in our newsletter. So it's really great to actually have you available here to talk to us today about the latest trends and to join us in the discussion. So thank you very much and welcome, Devie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. You're based in London at the moment, right?
I am, yes. I've been based in London for the longest period I've ever been continuously in London for. I've never not traveled so much. So it's been quite an interesting period. I've discovered new parts of my neighborhood.
It's a weird time, eh? And but as we also discovered a little bit just before the session just now, is that virtually you travel a lot still.
Yes, absolutely. It's been really busy with virtual events, actually. So I was on an event in Asia, based in Singapore yesterday. It was quite a global event, although it was technically an Asian event. And I've been on events almost nonstop in the last couple of weeks. And it's been amazing to see the world coming together to organize virtual networking because we were
nice, huh?
missing that. Yeah.
And so what do you find? Do you find it also still very engaging to connect to these networks now virtually? Do you get the same out of it as you would normally have when you would be traveling?
I think it's a long-term question, to be honest, Don.
Yeah.
I think virtual networking definitely is better than no networking. But how does that translate to working together, to signing contracts, to actually replacing sitting together and working as a team? That's yet to be seen. I am a skeptic on that side. I would say that working together in person is hugely productive. So it's something to be seen how it pans out.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we haven't found the complete social edge yet, even though a lot of the platforms we use are called social networks. I don't think that they're that social at the moment, and we still have to reinvent that game, I think, in a virtual world. But I share that experience as well. At least it's better than nothing, indeed.
Yes, I agree.
Hey, it's great of you to join. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're a co-founder at Burnmark. So what do you do with Burnmark? You do a lot of research and you have, I think, quite unique insights into developments of the world. But what's going on there at the moment? What are you up to?
So I spent almost a little more than half my time on Burnmark. It's a fintech research company. So we provide data and insights on the fintech market to large financial institutions, banks, governments, and regulators. So we use some of the data that we have, the database of from around 85 countries, I think, and use that data to come up with trends and insights for the future. So we've just published yesterday a new report on RegTech. And this is our latest piece of work. And we have talked to quite a few banks to understand how they're dealing with RegTech. And we've kind of put together a good set of data. So I hope you get a chance to check it out. And that's the kind of thing we do. We publish reports. Also, we provide data on a private basis to institutions.
We can definitely also include that in our newsletter that goes out today. So that's a nice one. And so maybe just briefly on your conclusions there, as you also talk to regulators, how do you see, I think they've been a bit resistant to broad use of RegTech, especially for the interaction between financial institutions and their work, right? So where RegTech becomes subtech, basically. What's your conclusion there? Do you see that that's taken off at the moment?
Yes, actually, it's a topic that's very close to my heart, and I know some of the people who are listening. I'm looking at you, Rick, who are very big fans of RegTech as well. Now, the reason it's quite exciting as a topic is that RegTech is one of the few areas of growth in fintech that's not been affected by COVID and the economic crisis
Yep.
that we're in the middle of. I think RegTech can actually add a lot of value in terms of revenues or customer experience on the front end with KYC onboarding, etc. And also all the way to things like SupTech or reporting that we generally don't see. It's less glamorous than the challenger banking side of fintech.
Yep.
But to me, this is far more exciting and where we can truly add value to the ecosystem. So one of our conclusions, for example, is that we've been talking about SupTech for the last 5 years or so. I'm sure you're familiar with that. But we've actually gone and looked at what each regulator is doing. And we found that all of the predictions we've been making in the last 5 years, the regulators have actually launched initiatives, they've got results, and we've actually put that together. So we know that it's working. And I think that proving that it's actually working for regulators and also for banks in terms of their initiatives, I think that's been really good from the point of view of the report to see. And collaboration is improving as always. And one of the things that we found is banks are collaborating with each other far more than ever before. If you asked me 3 years ago, I would name maybe 1 or 2 consortiums of banks working together. But in the report, we're talking about dozens of them. So it's been quite an interesting change in RegTech, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's really it's really funny to see indeed that RegTech and related subjects are really accelerating through the COVID crisis. And it indeed also the collaboration part is also funny that you mentioned that, because, for example, this week it was announced that the major Dutch banks are actually forming a consortium to tackle KYC and anti-money laundering activities, because they see that they can't do it by themselves anymore, and they're really trying to set up a consortium that involves also a lot of public support from the Ministry of Finance as well as the Dutch Central Bank, to actually come up with a solution that works and helps basically get the friction out of the way around anti-money laundering fighting.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see these developments. So thanks for sharing that, and we'll definitely pick up on that report also today. So besides Burnmark, what else are you active in?
Yeah, I have about 20 full-time jobs, though. But I do spend a lot of time pre-COVID on the speaking circuit. So I travel quite a lot doing keynotes at events. I've just published my book on on Financial Services Guide to Fintech early this year. I spend a lot of time writing, blogging, teaching as well. I teach at a couple of universities in the UK.
Nice.
And the Harvard University short courses that run through the year. So there are a couple of things that I'm now moving into in that. I think one of the big problems I find in fintech is that we talk about it a lot, but the real information, the real skills development is still not where we should be. And I think I'm trying to fill that gap with kind of the education side, in that training the next generation to be familiar with fintech and work towards practical use cases. So that's something I'm quite passionate about as well.
Yeah, I think that's really nice. I recognize what you're saying. I think it's very much still something for the financial industry, which is surrounded with a lot of jargon and relatively technically positioned. While if you would actually think about, and I also find it a challenge that we try to contribute to, is how do we actually get everyone else to get access to all these tools that are available, right? So it's fabulous if you could actually get much more people to make use of it. But that means you would have to cut through all the jargon and all the technicalities around it that make it look very complex. Yeah. And that's, I think, indeed one of the challenges we have to tackle. And so maybe about your book, I think it's really interesting. The Financial Services Guide to Fintech. Sounds like a fabulous title to describe, because there's a lot of confusion still about what to do with fintech. Tell us a little bit about your conclusions from there. Are you really trying to help the incumbents deal with the fact that their industry is completely being overhauled?
Yeah, I think that book is really targeted at incumbents and financial institutions who are still trying to understand how to work with fintechs. So it's all about effective partnerships. It's all about how do you work together to make change happen, and what are the use cases that people are working on that you can learn from. So it is really a very, very practical guide to kickstarting your innovation if you're not there yet, and really looking at examples from around the world to kind of see, okay, this is something you can do, just like a similar bag in another part of the world. Now, we kind of based in Europe tend to be in a little fintech bubble. I always feel when I travel that we think that Europe has amazing innovation, but in the large scale of things, like I said, if you look at the 85 countries in our database, it's far less in terms of innovation than some of the rest of the world. And I think that's something we have brought out in the book as well, in that these are examples from Latin America, Asia, Africa, that we can learn from and probably be far more efficient doing something. And the scalability is another angle, right? I mean, we have challenger banks in the UK that have a few million customers, same
Yep.
in Western Europe as well. But we're talking about hundreds of millions of customers in challenger banks launched 3 years ago in Asia.
Yep.
So the scale is massively different. So there are a lot of lessons in scalability, in partnerships, in innovation, in efficiency that we can learn from different people around the world. And that's really what I've spoken about in terms of how do we work together as banks and fintechs together, even with regulators, and bring about real use cases around fintech.
Yeah, I think that definitely is a good point. Let's say I think it's been quite a struggle. You see, of course, that at the beginning, startups and newcomers in the industry really try to challenge the incumbent players, and they try to pick a fight at first. But of course, then becoming more pragmatic later on, they figured out that probably partnerships would be the best to work. So, and I think that's something that people are convinced of already for a couple of years. But indeed, exact how to do it is still quite a mystery. And you see that there's a lot of experiments. And I tend to see also that most banks are still better capable of making an investment in a company than to collaborate with them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's, of course, really challenging.
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, I don't think any of us would say that it's an easy thing, and they have to start doing it right away. I mean, there are problems from cultural to working together in the same office, to what clothes you're wearing compared to the startup sitting in your office, all the way to issues of data sharing, legacy systems, sharing the infrastructure, replacing some of the existing systems. It's a 10-year process. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow.
I think so too. So what did you find an example that is really sort of where you think that they actually did it right, even though things might have gone wrong, but that you at least saw that the approach was the right one?
Yeah, I don't want to name names, but because every bank is different. But I think the different banks have taken different approaches to this. To give you an example of someone who has actually changed from the inside out. One of the case studies we cover is DBS Bank in Singapore.
Yep.
And one of the things that they did was before even thinking about partnerships, they changed all the internal processes. Now that's a daunting task in itself, but knowing the fact that they had to change the processes to work with external parties really helped them move the process much more quicker than with any other bank in Europe. And with that, they actually, and it helps them, of course, because a much smaller market than what we are dealing with here in terms of the number of consumers. But the changing of internal processes, using internal resources first, understanding your strengths, your market advantages, and then moving on to partnerships really worked well for them.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we have players in India, for example, who have been partnering on an open banking kind of play for almost 4 years now. So we are talking about open banking here in Europe, but the same principle has happened in India with the regulatory change about 4 years ago. So we can actually look there to understand how banks are effectively implementing open banking systems and also sharing data through open frameworks. There are really fantastic examples there. So, I mean, if we look out, we will find interesting things.
Yeah, I think so too. I think in general, you see indeed that Europe tend to think that the world there is so different that we can't look at it because it's from a different planet, basically. But I also do believe that there's a lot we can learn from there. Yeah, very interesting. One thing I think that struck me with the way that you described how DBS did it was that one thing I think that's sort of key to that is that you have to act as one organization. And I think that might also be one of the bigger challenges for a larger organization, is to actually be there as one organization. So having one clear vision, one clear idea on how to do innovation, and then operate as one organization to make it work. Instead of, for example, having an innovation department trying to do all kinds of enthusiastic deals, but never passing the procurement department because they're not on board.
Yeah.
For example.
I mean, I think one of the good examples in Europe we should look at as well is Barclays in the UK. I mean, they are one of the earliest people to identify the partnership need. And they have also kind of gone about in an interesting way in that outside of the innovation department, there was a lot of awareness of the need to work closely with fintechs. So they would come up with business cases in other parts, every part of the organization, and then use those business cases to give to the startups that they're working with in the accelerator programs or others. And there's an incentivization mechanism internally as well for managers who absolutely don't care about fintech, but now are incentivized to actually work with a fintech. So I think even in Europe, there are good examples of that, but I think you're absolutely right. It's not the innovation team's job to work with fintech. And if you see it as an innovation team's job, then you're never going to be able to integrate some of the ideas into the organization. It has to start with real problems, and it has to start with business cases around, is it going to be increased revenues, or is it going to be improved metrics for me as a business unit? Otherwise, it's never going to last, is what I've seen.
And so in that light, so I do tend to always think that large very easily works with large and small very easily works with small, right? Because you have much better cultural fit usually, and you better understand sort of each other's organizational structures. From that perspective, I thought this week was quite interesting to see that Deutsche Bank and Google signed a 10-year deal to help them provide their services. What do you think about that?
I think it's fantastic. I mean, we talk about big tech as a threat to fintech, but I don't actually see them being interested in fintech at all. I mean, these kind of partnerships is a great example of where big techs have a strength of offering their advantages, which is mainly data and analytics and the algorithms around everything that they're doing. So I think that is their strength. What fintechs don't understand is, I mean, Amazon is probably never going to launch a bank, and Facebook is never going to do that, but they're going to be able to offer these kind of services to the bank or in partnership with the bank rather than going directly to market because their strength is that data that they're sitting on. It'll be quite interesting to see what they work on in the next few years.
Especially, I think what I thought was interesting here is because indeed, from that perspective, Google Cloud Services, I think you can better compare a bit with like IBM, right? So the power engine behind a lot of financial services institutes. And I think Google is very slowly also moving into that domain in financial services. And at the same time, you see them, of course, with their role that we're, as a consumer, more familiar with on the front end, trying to help us create a smooth experience while entering the digital world. And I think they at least the press release said something about that they really want to mix that and also help Deutsche Bank work on their front end and create a different delivery strategy for that. So I think that's quite interesting. And I even got a call from a journalist who said, like, I would never have expected Deutsche Bank to be the bank to announce a deal like this.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, German banks have always been a bit worried about privacy, as we were talking about earlier. I mean, they have been one of the fiercest protectors of privacy and social media data. So it's quite interesting to see that.
Yeah. I think as well, I called it here. You of course have to the law of the limiting advantage, right? So if you're way ahead, you usually won't change that easy. But I think here it's the opposite that counts, is where they're basically lagging behind, so they need to make a leap forward. I think already for a couple of years, people have been talking about Deutsche Bank not being able to join the innovative league of banks. And I think that they really discovered now a path to make a big leap forward. And they might even surpass, I think, some of the banks that we thought were the most innovative ones recently in Europe.
I mean, that's all it takes. I think one partnership has the potential to do that. I mean, it may sound a little bit fantastical to say that now they're going to overtake some of the banks that have been working on innovation for the last few years, but that's all it takes. It's that one big initiative, if done right, with internal capabilities built in to drive through this, then I think they can actually do that. Yeah, it'll be quite interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, so I think that's yeah, it's quite cool to see. Well, in any case, I think it's everyone's going to be looking very much at this collaboration to see how it's going to turn out and revamp Deutsche Bank's offering potentially. Yeah, so I think it's interesting. You talked a lot about the neobanks as well, right? So I think that you said already that I think has been quite a hype, and you still see that we talk a lot about the neobanks. They're still quite an appealing category to talk about because they still are a bit the change agents, right? So I think they're showing the way to what the experience with financial services should look like potentially, even though we are also seeing over the past years that they're converging towards becoming more and more similar to traditional banks, also just because the regulators will entice them to do that. But we still see several news, like for example now SoFi also applying for a banking license, and I still see, you saw of course last week we had TransferWise, who was also going to go for additional licenses to provide other financial products. Do you believe that it's still, maybe your research has already some background, do you believe that we would still go to one universal entity that will supply us with our complete financial life? Or do you actually believe it's going to be much more of a networked group of companies that will supply us with whatever we need, with just a really clear entry point that facilitates that, but that might not make, right, like a money supermarket that actually doesn't make any products themselves?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. If in 2015, 2014, it was very much about disaggregation, in that every startup was offering something that was very small and unique. But I think that phase is gone. If you look at SoFi, for example, they're as big as a bank in the US. Yeah. They're probably bigger than 80% of the community banks in the US. So it's the fintechs that we talked about being disaggregating the side of lending, payments, current accounts separately are now fairly big and offering an umbrella set of services. So what I predict, or what I think will happen, is that we are going to go back to an aggregated economy, but instead of having one single bank account, we will probably work with 2 or 3 players as consumers, and then use them based on the strength of their offerings in each circumstance in our lives. Yeah. And it's not yet fully integrated to work like that, but I think it will happen. And that's why partnerships are so important. For example, SoFi is a great example. They're going to have license, they're going to have bank accounts. But in our research, we find that people still have a traditional bank account. Yep. While taking a new account in SoFi or with Monzo or Starling Bank. Yep. So the primary account is for current and savings is still the traditional bank account. Now, unless there is a real push to change, they're not going to switch their bank account fully to the challenger bank. So it's about 83% of people don't switch their accounts in any given year. So it's a fairly big number who don't switch at all. And then to challenger banks is an even smaller number. So what we find in our research is that people use that as a secondary account, for example, when traveling. Now, it may be quite interesting to you that we actually did found some figures over the COVID period and how people are using accounts. So there's only one challenger bank that has increased the downloads of apps in the last few weeks, and that is Starling Bank. Okay. Again, none of us know why, but I mean, we have ideas, but we don't know why for certain. But the fact that Monzo, Revolut, N26, all of them have actually reduced the number of downloads compared to the same period last year is quite telling. It actually tells you that people were using Monzo primarily when they're traveling for the travel and lounge features, for example, currency exchange as a feature. All of those were appealing to people. But now if you're stuck in a place, do you primarily use your traditional bank again then? So it's been quite eye-opening to me as well to see that the figures have not been favorable to challenger banks in terms of people being at home.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the number of people who have downloaded banking apps has actually not increased either. It's kind of stayed the same or decreased. And even in Asia, it's picking up now, but it didn't increase much in Asia. And so even traditional app bank users, if you had an app before COVID, you still used it, but not new people were not downloading it. New people were finding new ways of using payments and new ways of signing up to accounts. So it's quite fascinating to look at this trend in the last 3 months to kind of figure out where
it imply a lot of things. It could also imply quite some, let's say, the effect of social influence on actually downloading these apps, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I think you've hit the spot there. It's a lot of peer and social and workplace influence as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, really interesting indeed. Yeah, I did see already a big trend as well. You see that, for example, in alternative lending, that there's a decrease of appeal to alternative lenders as well, because people tend to turn to their familiar channels. So much more entrepreneurs called their bank when they were in crisis rather than look for new alternatives. Yeah. That's just, I think, the hunch that we have. If we get into a certain distress, we go for our familiar routines rather than something new.
Absolutely.
And that's well, quite, yeah, definitely very interesting to see that. I think, but I think going back to what you said about the neobanks, what I find appealing there is that what I think is one of the challenges is in how far will you need a banking license to be able to have the liberty to do what you want, right? So I think, for example, think about N26, who has a very limited product scope. They do everything in collaboration, but they still need their banking license to be able to fulfill that role. Think about, for example, also Adyen, who also got a banking license because they felt that they needed the room to expand their product offering, and only a banking license would provide that. While at the same time, I see that the banking license might be one of the things that actually prohibit you to do what your customer wants. Because actually the regulatory pressure and the framework that you need to fit into limits your capabilities to act like Google or Facebook or Amazon on behalf of your customer. So I think that's one of the friction fields that we're currently looking at as well, where I think the regulatory developments have a lot of influence on what the future will look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. I told you I'm a cynic in the world of fintech. So I kind of like the idea that fintechs are getting more and more licensed now. And the reason is that I said the switching of 83% of people don't like to switch. The reasons the 17% of people switch is because of cybercrime or fraud or something that really goes wrong with that bank. That's the primary reason people look for other banks. So I would rather fintechs be on the side of precaution and risk and kind of do the right thing and be licensed and observed rather than something going wrong and that affecting the whole fintech industry. I don't need to tell you in the last few weeks with the issue of a certain company, fintech has been affected a lot in terms of trust and in terms of people asking, is payments what are the other players actually doing with payments processing? So it is an issue if one fails, and then we have a domino effect on fintech. So I would much rather be on the safe side with regulation, but that's personally my view. I agree that.
No, I fully agree. So let's say I think the regulations is really important. The problem is I think that once it's too heavily regulated, probably another party not regulated will be the one in control of distribution, and so you still. Right, so that's probably then when a non-regulated party will help us sew it all together. And the question is always, what's the right balance, right? Between, and it needs to be regulated because we want a safe environment and a fair playing field, and safeguards societal needs as well. But at the same time, we also see that people always try to find the least friction in their solution, and that gives a lot of room for parties to step in between. And try to sort of circumvent the regulatory pressure one way or the other to fulfill that customer need. And I think that's one of the challenges I think that we have to solve somewhere in the coming period. And I think we can talk about this for hours, but I'm afraid we're already running out of time, Devie. But it's been a lot of fun to talk to you about this, and I think it's really interesting to see what you've discovered with your research, as well as I think what you wrote in your book about collaboration. So we'll definitely send the links to those also in our newsletter today, so people can find their way into that. So please check out hollandfintech.com/newsletters if you want to subscribe to that. And Devie, for me, again, a lot of thanks for joining us today. It was really wonderful to talk to you again.
No, it's great to talk to you, and thank you for having me. I look forward to reading your newsletter now.
Thank you. Looking forward to again also to read your new book. Just one final hunch. What are you going to talk about in your new book?
Yes. So in my next book, it will be a topic that's probably slightly away from fintech, but something that's very close to my heart. Kind of looking more at how people behave with fintech and how our behavior has changed, and also looking at what the developing countries are doing. So I'm going to spend a lot of time interviewing people in Asia and Africa in my next book. So
really interesting. Looking forward to that. So please keep us posted.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Devie. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Goodbye, everyone.